Good morning and good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience from around the world. Let me welcome you all to our special event co-hosted by the Antalya Diplomacy Forum and the International Peace Institute in New York. The forum aims to promote a fusion of thought with action in service of sustainable peace and development in the world. It's an initiative launched by Minister Çavuşoğlu, who will take the floor, so to speak, soon. Today, we are linking 3 different continents and several cities online for a very timely and relevant discussion. The topic today is the impact of the pandemic on conflict dynamics and mediation efforts. We have a stellar panel and a great moderator. So without further ado, I'm handing the mic over to my co-host, Mr. Terje Rød-Larsen, President of the IPI.
Thank you very much for those words, Ambassador. And it is a great pleasure and honor for me, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, to welcome you to this extremely timely online discussion on the topic, how the coronavirus pandemic affects conflict dynamics and mediation, new challenges to peace and security. Let me start by saying that the 2020 outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic has laid bare the vulnerability of the international system to pandemic disease as a threat both to public health and the global economy. However, up till now, much of the international attention has been, and rightly so, focused on the health dimension of the virus. In addition to efforts to accelerate production and access to diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines to prevent further spread of the virus and thereby saving lives. But much is still unknown about this virus and its impact. The impact is being felt far beyond global public health and in the financial, humanitarian, and security sectors. As time moves on, the economic and security ripple effects will be profound. People's lives and livelihoods are being upended. Global security is at risk. Both urgent action and long-term thinking are needed in parallel. Urgent action is needed to stem the current crisis and prepare for the potential cyclical recurrence of COVID-19. And long-term thinking is required to mitigate the effects of this crisis on international peace and security, sustainable development, and humanitarian affairs, and to prepare for future pandemics who undoubtedly will come. Today, we will be focusing on the particular effect of COVID-19 and its effects on conflict dynamics and peacemaking worldwide. What is the risk that violent non-state actors will take this crisis as an opportunity to further foment extremism and armed conflict? What is the potential for increased instability as the pandemic disrupts humanitarian aid or exacerbates inequality and political division? How will the coronavirus present obstacles to the traditional tools used for the maintenance of international peace and security, including UN peacekeeping, mediation, and peace building? These are questions to be addressed. We are very, very fortunate to have today with us an absolutely excellent panel to discuss all this and beyond. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank particularly our partners for the event, the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, who has been our partners in this endeavor. Now, without further ado, I will give the floor to the Foreign Minister of Turkey, who is also the co-chair of the Friends of Mediation group, both in the UN, in the OSCE, and in the OIC. Mevlut, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President Rød-Larsen, my dear colleagues Pekka and Ignacio, Undersecretary Di Carlo, Commissioner Chergu, dear colleagues. and dear participants from around the world. The pandemic has fast-forwarded us in the digital age. Most of us were already prepared. The theme of the Istanbul Mediation Conference in last October, the UN Group of Friends of Mediation, Ministerial, and Antalya Diplomacy Forum were all related to the digital age. I announced Turkey's digital diplomacy initiative last August, and we now see how relevant our efforts are. The ADF is a new initiative by Turkey to combine informed debate with diplomatic action. The pandemic forced us to launch the forum on the digital platform, and today marks our first event. And we are very happy to partner with the IPI for this opening event. I had the pleasure to attend the IPI events during the UNGA in previous years. All participants here are directly engaged in peacemaking. With Finland, we are co-chairs of the Friends of the Mediation Group at the United Nations. Switzerland joined us in a similar group at the OSCE. The success of the initiatives led to the formation of a similar group within the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And the UN Group of Friends of Mediation now has 60 members. The group aims to keep mediation high on the agenda of the international community. And this event is part of an effort to remind us all that we need mediation. We need it more than ever now, as the world with the pandemic presents even more challenges. The pandemic has already complicated the existing efforts to find peaceful resolutions to conflicts. UN Security Council is ineffective. Months have passed since the outbreak of pandemic, and the Council has yet to come up with the joint resolutions. And we see escalation in geopolitical rivalries. Peacekeeping operations are affected. Troop rotations and deployments are frozen. Mediation and facilitation efforts are impaired. As our focus is on the pandemic, the parties to various conflicts became more blatant. In Libya, the putschist warlord Haftar has increased his indiscriminate attacks against civilians, particularly in Tripoli. In Yemen and Syria, conflicts continue to claim lives. Israeli government plans to annex parts of the West Bank. Terrorist organizations and extremist groups also perceive a window of opportunity. Recent reports on increased Daesh attacks in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan are alarming. The pandemic didn't stop the atrocities of the PKK-YPG. Far-right groups circulate conspiracy theories and stigmatize Muslims, refugees, Asians, and many others. Vulnerable groups, including IDPs, refugees, and migrants, are affected the most. The United Nations stressed that more than $90 billion is needed to control the pandemic and protect 10% of the world's most vulnerable. And in Idlib, the interim government had to introduce measures for 5 million people living in opposition-controlled areas. They need immediate support. The plight of Rohingya continues unabated. Economic crisis could also spark new tensions. There is a severe decline in employment. The World Food Programme warned of a possible hunger pandemic. This is not something we can sit idly by and wait for it to happen. I'm not here today to draw a very pessimistic picture, but these are the challenges that we are facing and we will be facing in the future. So we must focus on the peaceful resolution of conflicts and address the plight of vulnerable groups. We must ensure uninterrupted flow of humanitarian aid. We must also make international organizations relevant and credible again. We have seen the urgent need to reform the Security Council of the UN Security Council and UN agencies. That said, this is not the time to further weaken the existing mechanism. This is not the time to criticize them. This is the time to extend our support as much as possible. Later on, we can sit and we can review the situation, how to reform them. And the pandemic is another reminder of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We should invest in them. We need to be creative in using new digital platforms. For instance, in Yemen, the UN is bringing the parties together over video conference meetings. None of this can be successful unless we work together. The pandemic has taught everyone a valuable lesson in globalization. What happens anywhere affects everywhere. No country is safe until all countries are safe. We must keep multilateralism alive. The enemies of a rule-based global order will look for an opportunity to take unilateral steps. Multilateralism shouldn't be another casualty of COVID-19. And it is not strong rhetoric, but rather effective cooperation action or cooperative action that will save the day. So once again, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister, for your candid observations and perspectives, and particularly I took note of your call for more effective global action and joint action. So thank you once again, and I will now give the floor to the Foreign Minister of Finland, Pekka Haavisto.
Thank you, Terje, and thank you, Mevlut, for your opening words. Thank you for the organizers, IPI and Antalya Diplomacy Forum. Of course, COVID-19 is first and foremost a health crisis, but with far-reaching implications on all spheres of life, and particularly it will have a very huge economic implications to our society. Pandemic poses a threat also for international peace and security. It can intensify existing conflicts, stall peace processes, and wake up old tensions. Even if current focus is in the health crisis, we must continue to focus on conflict prevention and promoting peace processes. It is disappointing that the Security Council has not been able to agree on a resolution addressing the threat of COVID pandemic to the international peace and security. I want to underline the importance of multilateralism and the rules-based international order. This must be in the core of our response to pandemic too. The UN system and WHO need our strong political and financial support. I couldn't agree more with Mevlut on this point. This is not the time to shake the international institutions. Finland also has been contributing additional funding to WHO in these circumstances. I welcome the UN Secretary General's appeal for global ceasefire. Proposal has gathered widespread support, but unfortunately, concrete results have remained rather minimal. According to one study by US NGO, only 10 of 43 conflict countries have responded to the UN call. In some countries, the situation has even deteriorated and fighting has escalated. In some countries, cases like Sudan, the pandemic has complicated the transition process further. However, there are some positive exceptions. We can see reduction of violence in some countries at the local level, for example, in the Philippines. In Yemen, there are some encouraging signs, even if the situation remains volatile. It's important to support Yemen and its neighbors to continue the positive track, as well as Special Representative Griffith's work. Long-term implications for fragile states and conflict situations are yet to be seen. Existing inequalities between the countries and inside the societies are likely to deepen. On a positive note, the pandemic could provide opening for peace processes. This happened in history in Aceh after tsunami. Working together over conflict lines to fight pandemic may build confidence between the parties and promote dialogue. Important that the international community stands ready to support swiftly the positive openings in conflict regions that the pandemics may bring. In some political transitions, the international community is considering some form of peace dividend to welcome political settlements, for example, by debt rescheduling. This is the case, for example, regarding Somalia. At the same time, for example, in Africa, economic integration is increasing. Combining these trends might support the regional stabilization. Then I want to finish with two remarks, or three remarks. First, on human rights. When there has been a full lockdown in some societies, it looks that some countries are using this to putting too harsh conditions to and restrictions to the population and challenging democratic values. My other points are the vulnerable groups. I'm thinking particularly women and girls, marginalized groups in societies that might be under extra stress in these COVID-19 conditions. And we know from many peace processes how crucial the role of the women, youth, girls are in peace processes. And then my final remarks is first about the disinformation. Of course, this COVID-19 situation gives a huge opportunity also for all kinds of disinformation. That's the negative side. Positive side of the new technologies, of course, is that we can use the new technologies also as a peace-building tool, and we can engage particularly the young people and youth through social media and new technologies, digitalization. So we will see some kind of digitalization of the peace processes as well. Thank you.
I heard a strong appeal for global action through multilateral organizations. And of course, as is well known, you are also the co-chair of the Friends of Mediation group in the UN and in the OSCE in Vienna. Thank you again. And I'm now moving to the head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, Ignacio Cassis, who is the co-chair of the Mediation group in the OSCE. Ignacio, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Rød-Larsen. Dear colleagues, Mevlut and Pekka, dear Under-Secretary General, and dear Commissioner for Peace and Security, if already disappeared from the conference. Thank you, especially you, Mevlut, and the ADF for the organization of this panel. I hope you are well, and I'm glad to join you for this discussion. The COVID-19 pandemic has tremendously affected our societies in the last weeks. I want to express my sympathies to you and all your countries for the loss of life and severe economic damages. Switzerland is now gradually reducing the confinement and reopening schools, trade, and restaurants. But the economic effects of the lockdown are huge. At time, 1 out of 3 employees are under partial unemployment benefit scheme. We are entering a new normality with many questions. The capacities of our health system and our economy were heavily tested. We had to put measures in place that are truly exceptional for a democracy like ours. Our parliament is now meeting again, re-establishing the necessary democratic checks and balances. In contexts that are prone to violent conflict, the current pandemic poses fundamental challenges of humanitarian, economical, and political nature. How can democratic systems protect themselves from abuse? Pekka has already mentioned about that. How can we ensure that exceptional and temporary extensions of executive powers remain short-term? How can those who voice criticism be protected in the right to do so? How can those who depend on outside scrutiny for protection still be guaranteed safety despite the closure of borders, emergency measures, and a massive presence of security forces? The call for a global ceasefire by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres provides an answer. Its message is quite simple. Instead of continuing fighting, let us work together in overcoming the crisis. The initial response from conflict parties in many different contexts has been positive. Switzerland, together with Canada, was instrumental to mobilize 60 UN member states to express support for the call. My country has also been active over the past months in promoting the UN call in contexts as diverse as Cameroon and Colombia. In Cameroon, as part of our commitment to peace, we work to promote social cohesion during the pandemic in order for communities to cope better with the challenges presented by both the conflict and the pandemic. In every crisis, there is also an opportunity. This is why my ministry has come up with a rapid response mechanism to stimulate peace, rule of law, and human rights during the pandemic. To date, 21 projects have been funded to jumpstart innovative activities. For example, we are supporting initiatives that contribute to safeguarding democratic standards in the crisis through fostering dialogue by means of digital technology among leaders and experts. Indeed, innovation is a key in adapting to the challenges of the COVID crisis. Digital technology help us keep up the contact with and among conflict parties in peace processes. They also give us the means to monitor events. These technical tools and experiences may be of help beyond this crisis. But peace will never come about virtually. It will always require the physical presence and the trust of very real women and men. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, for Switzerland and our long-standing tradition of offering good offices to conflict parties, one essential element has not changed with the crisis. More than ever, we stand ready to support dialogue efforts and peace negotiations and to mediate where we are invited to do so. Mediation is about trust. It is about patience. It is also about preparing the ground for the future, for future negotiations. This is what allows the conflict parties to start working towards a peaceful settlement of their conflict. All hands on deck. That is going to be the call for us all. The expertise, support, and resources from all countries will be needed to revive stalled peace process after the crisis. We will continue our work for peace and even strengthen it further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, and also for that very powerful appeal you gave. And again, what we heard is a very holistic approach, not looking only at the narrow health issues, which are so burning across the globe, but also at multiple social, political, and economic, and particularly mediation effects of the pandemic. So with this call for, all these calls for more effective multilateralism, as I detect from all the interventions so far, for you, Rosemary, that must be music in your ears. So Rosemary DiCarlo is, of course, Under-Secretary General of the UN Department of Political and Peace-Building Affairs. And Rosemary, you now have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Terje. I'm very pleased to join you and honorable ministers today, and I'm grateful to Turkey for organizing today's event under the auspices of IPI. As other speakers have said, though the COVID-19 pandemic is foremost a health crisis, it has wide-ranging dimensions, and it risks hitting conflict settings especially hard. This is a time for vigilance. As the Secretary General recently informed the Security Council, the pandemic also poses a significant threat to international peace and security. He outlined a number of risks that are particularly pressing, including a further erosion of trust in public institutions if citizens perceive that authorities mishandle the response, an economic fallout that could create greater stressors, potentially leading to civil unrest, postponement of elections or the holding of a vote with or without adequate mitigation measures, leading to a crisis of legitimacy, conflict actors exploiting the situation to press their advantage, increased terrorist activity, and restrictions of movement making conflict prevention and resolution more difficult. All of this happening at a time when mediation efforts are needed now more than ever. The challenge for peacemakers and peacemaking at this time is great. On 23 March, the Secretary General appealed for a global ceasefire to stop the fighting, facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and open space for diplomatic engagement. He made his appeal in recognition of the fact that as conflicts rage, COVID-19 will further complicate our efforts to resolve them. Now, others have mentioned that the initial response was impressive, and support has come from every corner of the world and includes member states, regional partners, civil society, and prominent religious leaders. And combatants from Colombia and Cameroon to the Philippines and parts of the Middle East supported the appeal and took tentative steps to stop fighting. However, these initial gestures of support are not translating into concrete change on the ground. Regrettably, the guns are yet to be silenced. The situation in the Sahel has deteriorated following increased attacks, and extremist groups have disregarded the call and instead urged their followers to take advantage of COVID-19, including by spreading disinformation. In Libya, where the parties have called for humanitarian truces at various times in the past, the fighting has increased. The conflict has not stopped in Syria or Afghanistan. Last week's despicable attack on a maternity hospital in Kabul left 24 people dead and another 16 wounded, including women and newborn babies. Meanwhile, in Yemen, despite the announcement of a temporary unilateral ceasefire by Saudi Arabia on behalf of the coalition, the violence persists. Nevertheless, the ceasefire call has refocused attention on the suffering caused by armed conflict and the urgency to end fighting in order to face a new global common threat. And we must continue to apply pressure on conflict parties to stop fighting. Such pressure must also come from those supporting the conflict parties, politically or with weapons. A ceasefire can lead to discussions on lasting political solutions. While the pandemic has affected the practice of diplomacy and mediation itself, our envoys and missions have increased efforts to reignite political processes around the world, often through the use of digital tools and platforms to engage with conflict parties as well as other stakeholders, even in the context of ongoing fighting. In Libya, for example, the working groups established in Berlin have met remotely. In Yemen, as others have mentioned, the special envoy is making a concerted effort to expand the space for political talks through remote and in-person dialogue. And in Afghanistan, the government and the Taliban engaged through virtual means last month on prisoner releases, though talks have yet since stalled. Although we all recognize the limitations of dialogues, the increased use of technology has the potential to create and enhance the inclusivity of peace processes, including with the participation of women and young people. Now, the path ahead is not easy. Nobody said it would be. To succeed, the international community will have to come together decisively and help translate early gains, now fading, into lasting peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, and the Secretary General. Thank you also for participating at the Istanbul Mediation Conference last year with Secretary General Guterres. I think despite one glitch, we've had a very good start with our distinguished speakers. We're hoping to get, of course, Commissioner Chergui at another event. The speakers have walked us through the nexus of conflict, peace, safety, and development during and after the coronavirus outbreak. Pandemics have shaped the course of history in several instances throughout the history. In some cases, natural disasters or common challenges paved the way towards peace. And one such example that I remember was the 2004 tsunami in the Asia Pacific. It helped initiate the peace process that eventually ended a decades-long conflict in Aceh. It really depends on what we as international community do at critical junctures, and I think all the speakers have underlined this point. As Minister Çavuşoğlu wrote recently, what we do today will define tomorrow. I think we're all set to go further. I now invite the IPI President back to take us through the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both to you, Rosemary, and to you, Burak. And we are now some time left for the Q&A section. And we have actually received a number of questions already from around the world. And let me start with Priyal Singh, who is a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, in South Africa. The questions are from Singh as follows. What are some of the main peace and security contexts that have been currently affected by the pandemic? Next question, are there any key lessons that can already be identified and incorporated into a global set of best practices? I think I will go back to the Foreign Minister of Turkey to first address this question, and then we can go around to all the other panelists. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our friends who put the question from South Africa, Mr. Priyal Singh. The pandemic is more than a health crisis. It has a global socio-economic, political, and security implications. The erosion of the trust in public institutions, economic fallout in fragile countries, stalled peace processes, loss of credibility of international organizations, and deliberate attempts to erode multilateralism. We emphasize the importance of effective multilateralism today as well. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, terrorist groups and extremists are seeking ways to abuse this crisis. Daesh and Al-Qaeda celebrate the impact of the pandemic on the West. Boko Haram considers the pandemic as a plot against Muslims. Far-right groups are circulating various conspiracy theories. So when it comes to our key lessons, or two key lessons, first of all, the outbreak doesn't recognize any boundaries, social classes, ethnicities, or religions. Combating the pandemic has reminded us, of the need for solidarity to tackle COVID-19 related hate, xenophobia, and also scapegoating as well. And we also took the lesson that only if we join our efforts, we can overcome this pandemic. And as Turkey, we do our best to support the other countries that in need of medical equipment. We have already provided medical equipment to 82 countries out of 135 requested such kind of medical equipments from Turkey. So international cooperation, solidarity, and effective multilateralism is the best guarantee to maintain our security and stability. Therefore, during this pandemic, as Turkey, we increase our efforts regionally and globally. G20, OSCE ministerial, MIGTA initiatives, and Turkey Council meetings, and other meetings that I'm going to have another video conference together with our colleagues from Germany, UK, and France after this meeting. And I had another meeting recently with our French colleagues from neighboring countries, trilaterally, quadrilaterally. So we need the solidarity and cooperation more than ever now, and we should also take full advantage of the UN's and other international organizations' toolboxes, and mediation is just one of these tools. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we can criticize the international organizations, but because they are far from perfect, but this is not the time to criticize them. But we should take also lesson from this pandemic that these regional and international organizations are not capable to meet the needs of our societies today, or expectations of our societies today, or is not capable to face the challenges that we are all together facing today.
Thank you very much, Madlit, once again. And we will now move to Finland. And Pekka, you have the floor in order to address the question from Priyal Singh of South Africa.
Thank you, and thank you for Priyal Singh for a very good question. And first, I couldn't agree more with my good friend Mevlut on the multilateralism and the approach you have to international organizations. We certainly have to renew them, and there is room for criticism, but during the crisis I think it's very important that we support the UN system and multilateral organizations, including WHO, for developing the vaccination, developing the health response for COVID-19, and having the response as a global response, and there is where we particularly need the UN agencies. On peace processes and what kind of implications this situation can have, maybe a couple of remarks. One, of course, is this closure of societies due to the lockdown. I'm thinking now, I can mention North Korea, for example, that very little information and contacts are happening now during the COVID-19 period for obvious reasons, so the COVID-19 can slow down some of the processes. Then a very important issue that was also taken up by the Turkish foreign minister is that this is a perfect moment for xenophobia or hate speech or marginalizing groups, and we have seen the language used against Rohingya or in some countries against the Muslim minorities, accusing some minority for spreading the disease and so forth. Very nasty game is ongoing. And unfortunately we see photos where fighters are having their machine guns and their face masks at the same time. So they, let us take Libya for example, people just continue the fighting, maybe trying to protect themselves for the spread of the virus, but nothing else is happening or changing. So it's very important, of course, that we, even in these circumstances, keep the existing peace processes on track, and also use the new technologies and new approaches to reaching out new groups and starting new peace processes. I'm very much in favor, of course, when coming from Finland, on this digital peace mediation and all what technology can create. But of course, I also want to remind myself that, for example, when visiting the Central African Republic, people mention that only 10% have access to electricity. So there are countries where 90% of people are out of reach. They don't have mobile phones, they don't have computers. So it's good to remember that there are also parts of the world where the digital divide still exists very deep and also is influencing to peace processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pekka. I will now move to Switzerland. Ignacio, you have the floor to address the questions. Ignacio?
So now you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Hello? You're wonderful. Thank you, Terje, and thank you to Mr. Priyal Singh for these questions. Of course, no context remains unaffected. The actual magnitude of COVID-19 on ongoing peace process will only be assessed truly once we can work again directly with our counterparts. But for now, we are observing some context, like in Afghanistan, where we witness an increase in violence, for instance, or in Colombia with a unilateral COVID-related ceasefire who was not renewed. While in the Philippines, both government and the new People's Army continue with their ceasefire. In some context, elections are postponed. I'm thinking about Ethiopia, or are maintained despite the effects of the ongoing pandemic. I'm thinking about Burundi, which I guess will vote tomorrow, we select tomorrow. Both phenomena present risks and opportunities, of course. And these are just few examples. As I see it, at this present moment, there will be need to rebuild trust among the conflict parties once this pandemic has passed over. And this trust is not just given for itself. We have to build it together, and I guess the multilateral effort which we can emphasize is during the crisis and after the crisis must be huge, despite all criticism to UN and UN agencies, because during the crisis we have to work together to overcome the crisis and to meet the needs of the people.
Thank you very much. And then I will go to Rosemary again. Rosemary, you have the floor.
Thank you, Terje. I mentioned a few contexts in my statement that have been affected, but let me elaborate a little bit further. I do think Libya is a case in point where we now have parties really pushing their advantage. We saw twice in the month, in this last month, that bombs have hit a hospital in Tripoli, for example, that was designated as a site for COVID-19 patients. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab has increased its activities exponentially in the last few months. 27 elections have thus far been postponed this year. There will be more, I am sure. We heard about Burundi, for example, but also there are tensions in Bolivia because of a postponed election. We advise countries to have a consensus decision of all parties when it comes to whether an election should be conducted or postponed. And we are advising them on mitigation measures as well. Protests. We saw protests in Lebanon a few months ago, but they've been renewed because of COVID-19. This time the focus is somewhat different. Before it was about sectarian politics, it was about the economy, but now it's about hunger because of food insecurity. So we have some very serious problems and where COVID is really exacerbating existing tensions. As far as lessons learned, I think we need to be very careful of how we set our priorities, and we do need data-driven approaches. For example, there are oil-producing countries that are going to be hit probably even more by COVID-19 and will need our attention, both in terms of economic support, but also in terms of political engagement. We have to be careful and monitor excessive use of force in lockdowns. We've seen this happening. Hate speech, and sexual and domestic gender-based violence. Very important issue now. We see more and more women and children who are suffering. I think also, as far as another lesson learned, I think we now understand we need to be much better at developing partnerships with local mediators, individuals on the ground who can be working mediation activities in person while we are doing it remotely. Thank you.
I can see we have about half an hour left of the time to our disposal, and I've been requested to be very strict on the time limits here. So I will combine two questions which we have received. The first one is from Walid Al-Harari. He's with the Sana Center for Strategic Studies in Yemen. And the second one is from Priska Maniala, who is the president of the National Student Association in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I will go to Walid Al-Harari first. And there's a backdrop to his question. The backdrop is as follows. Last month, the UN Special Envoy to Yemen told the Security Council that he would seek to convene video conference meetings between the main warring parties in Yemen. Moving meetings online, while unavoidable due to COVID-19, represents a shift away from the local and customary mediation approaches, as well as away from the envoy's own strategy centered on personal interaction with stakeholders in Sana'a and Riyadh. And the question goes like this. What challenges are presented by shifting mediation to an online platform, and what impact would such a shift have on the art and on the craft of mediation processes? The second question, which I will refer to you, is from DRC, and Priska Maniaya, she remarks, in a conflict like the DRC, where humanitarian needs have to be met, The disruption of key humanitarian and development programs have serious consequences in remote areas affected by conflict. Then comes the question, what are best practices for ensuring that the needs of IDPs, refugees, returnees, and migrants are integrated into the COVID-19 responses? These are the two sets of questions. And Navid, I will go to Turkey first again. Can you please address the questions and share your perspectives?
Thank you very much. First, the question on Yemen. In Yemen, no parties on the ground have military superiority. That's why the war has been there. That's another reason that the war has been there for many years. In the absence of a constructive involvement of the international community, the war may drag on for many other years. Another source of concern is the resurgence of separatist movements in South, supported by one of the countries in the region, I mean the UAE. All these are against the background of major pandemic. And first of all parties should respect the call of the United Nations Secretary General for the cessation of the hostilities. As you mentioned at the beginning, despite all these efforts, the war still continues. Online mediation or similar interactions could, of course, be used under the current circumstances, and building and maintaining trust in online mediation will be more challenging. The human factor is very important in mediation efforts. This is what we have experienced. And this is why most of the time the parties to a conflict are brought together in an insulated setting. In online mediation efforts, parties might be more open to peer pressure when they are not in an isolated environment. It might also be more difficult to come up with creative on-the-spot solutions. Nevertheless, we cannot put on hold on all mediation efforts because of the pandemic, and there can also be pros of offline mediation. It could prevent heated debates that might result in one side leaving the table. In any case, digital diplomacy is our best chance under these conditions. With regards to second question on migrants and refugees, refugees and displaced persons are among the most vulnerable groups affected by the pandemic, as I stressed in my opening remarks. Most countries are focused on their national responses. However, refugees shouldn't be left to themselves. Some concrete recommendations based on our best practices. All COVID-19 healthcare measures at the national level should be taken for refugees as well. There should be no distinctions. Measures for new arrivals are important as well. Quarantine regulations should be carefully implemented for refugees, migrants, and IDPs. Their conditions should be monitored regularly. Detention centers, reception centers, and refugee camps should be regularly disinfected. And temporary housings for asylum seekers and refugees should be provided. As the largest refugee hosting country in the world, we always stress that helping refugees is not just the responsibility of the host countries. Fighting the pandemic is no exception. And 80% of the refugees live in the developing or less developed countries. It means that those countries should be supported now, and international community should be more vigilant. And UN's global humanitarian response plans include these refugee responses to the most affected or potentially affected countries. And we hope that plan gets the support it deserves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will then go to Switzerland. Ignazio.
Thanks a lot. I will start with the Yemen question, number 2, concerning online and digitalization, online platforms and digitalization. We very much, first of all, let me say that we very much support the endeavors of the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General to help bringing peace to Yemen. The use of online tools in peace processes may present opportunities, especially when nobody can travel for meetings in person. Such tools help maintaining contact. These tools are sometimes perceived as impersonal or not discretionary enough. Therefore, they might not always be the best option. I'm firmly convinced that for negotiation to be successful, the environment and the atmosphere are as important as the possibility to speak to each other formally. This is important because it helps building trust. It is often small side meetings or just an informal chat in the margin of formal meetings that allows for progress to happen. This is what digital tools do not offer, despite the chat rooms or lobbies. Let us nevertheless remain open-minded and, particularly in these times, make the best use of the digital opportunities in building peace. I come over now to the next question from DRC concerning the migrants and displaced persons. The first thing I want to recall is that we shouldn't forget that migrants and displaced persons faced serious needs and vulnerabilities prior to the COVID pandemic. This crisis has now exacerbated these needs and vulnerabilities. Among the main prerequisites to ensure that migrants, displaced persons, and their host communities are integrated in COVID responses is sustained and unimpeded humanitarian access. You know, the question of humanitarian access is always a central question. It is also important that the humanitarian assistance and protections are delivered in an impartial manner based on need alone, not to instrumentalize it for any other reasons. This ensures that forcibly displaced are not excluded from the assistance and protection. Then we must not forget that most migrants and displaced persons are not located in camps, but in informal settlements or in slums of large cities. Humanitarian and development action must include them and their host communities into their response. And finally, it is of vital importance humanitarian and development actors coordinate their response, that their interventions are part of one overarching plan with collective outcomes. This is the only way to ensure that the assistance is delivered in the most efficient and relevant way. We unfortunately assist somewhere in the world, in some place, that no coordination affects the people even more than no help at all. So we have to really pay attention to the question of coordination and to work together.
Thank you. We will then quickly move to Pekka of Finland. And I will ask you, Pekka, to address the questions. I can see we have now about 20 minutes left. So may I make an appeal that there are 2 more questions, which I will ask you to address, that we put everything in nutshells when we speak. Pekka, you have the floor.
Thank you, Terje. And very shortly, first, if you think what is the biggest enemy of digital diplomacy, of course, it's the bad lines. You know, when talking to Horn of Africa or calling to Somalia or to Sudan or recently to Eritrea, the lines are not perfect. And of course, this might prevent a little bit the digital diplomacy, but it's important that we use all those technologies that are available. I think regarding Yemen and Walid al-Hariri's question, of course, Yemen is one of those countries where there has been a positive response by countries involved to appeal of Secretary General, and this is of course a very good sign. But I think the question is right in that when you want to advance this kind of grassroots diplomacy and talk to talk to local level and so forth, of course, it's very difficult to start from the zero with the digital means. It's easier when you already know the people. Then to Priska Maniala's question, and I think Madame Di Carlo already touched in a very good way the vulnerable groups and the women and the domestic violence issues and all these. And of course, during this kind of crisis, this violence might increase and vulnerable groups are even more vulnerable, including refugees. We, for example, in Finland made this spring a decision to take 175 children, unaccompanied children, as refugee children to Finland. And of course, it raises also here domestically a big debate, you know, how do we prevent the COVID-19 if some of the children have it and so forth and so forth. So people are more concerned, even those recipient countries who are taking refugees, what is the health situation and how this will affect to the health. So these kind of additional concerns there, of course, are, but at the moment it's very important that we keep the borders open, we let the aid workers to work, we let the equipment to go also to the refugee camps, and of course the water, sanitation, awareness, testing capacity, protective equipment, all this is still crucial. And I just want to mention that when dealing with the African countries, of course, many of them remind us that they have a huge experience of the Ebola crisis, for example, that how to fight against the Ebola, maybe even better experience than what we have in Europe on fighting very, very dangerous diseases. Thank you.
Thank you, Pekka. Rosemary, you have the floor.
Thank you. As regards to Yemen and remote mediation, obviously, as others have said, mediation is a human-centric activity and face-to-face meetings are far better. It's extremely difficult to pick up on nonverbal cues in virtual meetings. There's no ability to explore informal moments. There's no corridor diplomacy. Security and confidentiality on online platforms also are of concern, particularly to many of the parties engaged. Access or degree of familiarity with digital technologies also varies greatly. That said, it is the only method we have at this point, and we must use it and learn to adapt some of the techniques that mediators have used in the past in virtual meetings. Obviously, when it comes to Yemen, Martin Griffiths is daily in contact virtually with people on the ground in Yemen. He's in contact with countries that have influence on the parties. He has done some traveling, but it's very difficult. As far as the most vulnerable, refugees, IDPs, migrants, etc. Just want to assure you that every country that has a UN country team, has humanitarian workers from the United Nations, has developed a plan in response to COVID-19, whether it's contingency or an actual plan they're implementing at this point. And vulnerable populations are very much in the forefront of their efforts. UNHCR, for example, has strengthened its efforts to implement COVID-19 prevention and response in refugee camps and displacement sites. And this is happening with a number of agencies working in humanitarian assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. We have now 15 minutes left to our disposal. I will take the risk of asking and combining two questions again. The first is from Pravina Makan Laka. She's a member of Femwise Africa, the network of African women in conflict prevention and mediation in South Africa. She observes, the coronavirus outbreak will lead to an amplification of existing inequalities and conflict fault lines. Women will be disproportionately affected. Is there a risk that we will witness a retreat in women's participation in mediation because of the changing conflict dynamics brought about by the virus? What strategies are needed to mitigate this looming risk? Then the last question is from Aisha Kuram. She's a student at Kabul University and former Afghan youth representative to the United Nations from Afghanistan. She observes, a lack of trust is growing on both sides in Afghanistan. Recent attacks put the future of the intra-Afghan peace negotiations at risk. A global health crisis does not recognize political boundaries and it presents obstacles to any in-person negotiations. How will the warring parties manage to hold intra-Afghan talks, considering these additional challenges created by COVID-19. Again, I will start with Turkey. Mevlut, you have the floor. And again, I will appeal to everybody, be brief and to the point. Thank you. Mevlut, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think we all agree that participation of women in peace process is key, and this fosters inclusion and ownership. Actually, statistics also prove that their presence at the negotiation table yields durable results. Women's participation increases to probability of a peace agreement lasting at least 2 years by 20%. And the probability of a peace agreement lasting 15 years by 35%. It means we achieve a lot over last 20 years. However, there is still room for further improvement regarding women's participation in peace processes. The outbreak will probably act as a conflict and inequality multiplier. It will also impact women and girls disproportionately, as highlighted by the Secretary General's report on the impact of COVID-19 on women. With regards to question on Afghanistan, I would like to thank Sister Aisha for this question. Afghanistan has suffered from an armed conflict for more than 40 years, and the time for peace has come in this country. There are promising steps, reduction of violence in February, agreement in Doha, I also participated, and prisoner exchange between the government and the Taliban. However, violence remains high, and the prospects for a peace agreements are getting dimmer. We urge all parties to end the violence and focus on the very interests of the Afghan people, especially against the background of the pandemic. And we are happy, we welcome and support the reconciliation between all these actors to form the inclusive and better representative government. I just spoke on the phone with Dr. Abdullah and also General Marshal Dostum, and I will speak to acting foreign minister immediately after this conference webinar. And as Turkey, we will continue, of course, supporting this country. But as I underline at every NATO meeting, we should stay in Afghanistan as long as they need us, and until the lasting peace and stability is ensured in the country. And we have many mechanisms to support Afghanistan. And we have also one initiative, Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan trilateral mechanism. We agreed to convene the ministerial meeting and the summit when the pandemic is over. And Turkey is going to host the Heart of Asia Istanbul Process Summit that we had to postpone because of the elections in the country. So regional ownership is also very crucial for the stability of the country. And we will continue standing by Afghan people in the future as well. They really deserve peace and prosperity.
Thank you, Mevlut. Pekka, Finland, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you first Pravina Makanlakha for a good question. I started by mentioning the women mediators. Finland has been supporting this network of the female mediators, and we need more women in the peace processes also on the mediator side. There are many cultures, many situations where women can talk to women easier than to men. And we need, of course, women to participate to the peace processes. And one way of doing it, of course, is that we should increase the support of local women organizations. I have been working with some women organizations in Somalia and so forth, and they have been doing remarkable work during the war conditions. And of course, with the new technologies, we hope that young people, women, could participate better in these processes. But of course, the risk of marginalization is there. And also in the COVID-19 situation, it is possible that women have to carry duties for their families and so forth, and do not have time for peace processes. And then to the Isa Kuram's question on Afghanistan. First, I would like to mention that Finland is co-hosting with the UN in coming November Afghanistan pledging conference. We think that this is a very crucial also for the political process. The conference will be in November in Geneva. And of course, how we see Afghanistan situation, that we stress all the time to inclusivity. Inclusivity, of course, of all the fighting parties, but also the inclusiveness regarding the civil society of the Afghanistan process and including women and youth. Without this inclusivity, the Afghan process will not fly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pekka, and then Ignacio, Switzerland.
Thank you. Regarding the first question of Pravina Makanlaka from South Africa, I really have nothing to add to that what Pekka has already said. I join his comments and his statement, as well as the comments of Madame Di Carlo. She commented before the question of women and their involvement in peace processes. To speed up the answer, I come to the next one, Aisha Kurman from Kabul University, concerning Afghanistan. And of course, I have already said in my opening remarks that the recent renewed violence in Afghanistan is very disturbing, and we call upon all sides to stop this violence. Indeed, the ongoing violence not only makes much needed effective response to the pandemic more difficult, it also puts at risk the rapid commencement of the intra-Afghan peace talks. These negotiations should be a promise for all Afghans to design their future in peace. They need to be designed well, and they need to have a solid basis so that all those engaging in these talks know what it is they can expect from them. From such an understanding, trust develops, and I've already mentioned the importance of trust before. Let me be clear: the political will to engage in negotiations on all sides, if it is strong enough, will overcome the hardest of the COVID pandemic. Switzerland stands ready, I've already said in my introducing remarks, to support reflections about the negotiation design for the intra-Afghan negotiations, where the parties to call for such support.
Thank you. Rosemary.
Thank you. First, let me just say that women are indeed disproportionately affected by the virus, and they should therefore be involved in any pandemic response plans, not just in mediation efforts. I think this is really important now to say. Second, when it comes to mediation, it is absolutely clear that women must be engaged, and we have been trying very hard to engage women and are intensifying our efforts in this anniversary year of Resolution 1325, 20th anniversary. Our envoys for Syria and Yemen have been engaging women before the pandemic and now through remote means as a way of bringing more people into peace processes, getting their voices heard, understanding their concerns. Special representative in Colombia doing the same in the implementation of the peace plan in Colombia, and has a wide circle of women that he deals with virtually at this point in that regard. I think it's extremely important that we champion the need to have women involved in mediation processes and peace processes. There is a concern that funding will go down, will decrease, but there's also a major concern that funding will decrease for conflict prevention during this period, given the other humanitarian and economic needs. And I don't think we should ignore dealing with conflict prevention at this critical period. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, I do think that the virtual meeting held by the Afghan government and the Taliban was a good step forward as a way of dialogue. They obviously then met in person. It's going to be extremely difficult, obviously, to bring as many people together as they would like during this period. There are virtual means, certainly not ideal. But when I was in Afghanistan last year, it was very clear to me that Afghans want peace from all segments of society. And I think that we must support them and do whatever we can in order to bring about greater dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. What is left for me now, we have 4 minutes left, is simply to thank you all. And particularly, I would like to say that we're very grateful to the Foreign Minister of Turkey and Foreign Minister of Finland, who initiated this session. I think all interventions we've heard from the panelists have been very candid and very, I would say, in addition, very passionate about finding solutions to the broad set of issues which the pandemic crisis are facing us with. And I've taken careful note of the holistic approach which everybody has tuned into, and also the unanimous call for multilateral action and to support the relevant multilateral institutions, and where, of course, the UN is at the heart of it. So my gratefulness to all of you. I think you've been excellent panelists, and it was very well done. So all that is left for me then is to say thank you once again. Wish you a good day or a good evening, a good afternoon, or whatever it is where you are, and wish you good luck in your important work in this particular field. Now I will give the floor to Burak Akapar for final remarks. Burak, you have the floor. Burak is the Director General for Foreign Policy Analysis and Coordination in the Foreign Ministry of Turkey. Burak, you have the floor.
Thank you, Terje. Thank you, Excellencies, for this wonderful, wonderful session. I think we've had a great discussion with lots of valuable insights, and I think very key takeaways for our future peace agenda. At times like these, the role and contribution of focal groups like the UN, OSCE, and OIC group of Friends of Mediation matter more than ever. If there is one time-honored message of these groups, it is that one can never give up searching for peace, and peace have to be sought collaboratively. The Antalya Diplomacy Forum will also be relentless in its search for peace and development and thinking about how to make it happen. Excellencies, your work to raise awareness on mediation and promote peaceful resolution of conflicts is most commendable. Thank you very much, the audience, wonderful audience we've had, for tuning in. Thank you for the excellent questions. Many greetings from the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, our valuable partner, International Peace Institute. Our activities will continue. I'm hoping to see you all in Antalya. Until then, stay well and healthy. Thank you.